Okay, so it is now 8:30 Mountain Standard Time, so I want to welcome everybody both in the room and virtually on Zoom to our session on protectionism and its consequences. We've got three very interesting papers, three great discussants, so let's proceed. And our first paper is Stephen Redding and co-authors that you can see up there talking about distributional consequences of trade. So, Stephen, can you jump in there?
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks so much for the invitation to participate in this session today. And sorry not to be able to be in Arizona. I'm sure it's a lot of fun there, and I'm definitely missing all the sunshine. This is a joint paper with Stefan Heblich.
Could you maybe speak up a little bit?
Sure. This is a joint paper. Can you hear that?
Yeah, now it's better. Yeah.
Great. This is a joint paper with Stefan Heblich and Yanos Zylberberg on the distributional consequences of trade. So what's the motivation for this paper? There's been a resurgence of interest in the distributional consequences of trade, following in particular Otto Dorn and Hansen's work on the China shock in the United States. So what we tried to do in this paper is provide new theory and evidence on these distributional consequences of trade, using perhaps one of the most influential trade liberalizations in history, the 1846 repeal of the Corn Laws in Britain. And so the way in which the repeal of the Corn Laws is going to be important for us in this paper is that it opens British markets to the trade shock in the late 19th century from the New World grain invasion. So our trade shock is going to be this grain invasion from North America, from the US, Canada, and Argentina and other countries in Latin America, the surge in imports of grains into the United Kingdom. And the Corn Laws are important because they mean that Britain is open to trade in those grains and maintains free trade in contrast to a number of other continental European countries. Traditionally, research on the Corn Laws and the grain invasion has focused on economy-wide distributional consequences of trade, considering different factors of production, such as labor versus land, as in the Heckscher-Ohlin model, or different industries, such as manufacturing versus agriculture, as in the specific factors model of international trade. Our key contribution is going to provide evidence on the geographically distributional consequences of trade, the way in which trade has uneven effects across different geographical regions within England and Wales. We've put together a new spatially disaggregated data set on population, employment, and land values for around 11,000 parishes in England and Wales over the course of more than a century. Key advantage of our empirical setting is that we have an exogenous measure of trade exposure to this grain invasion based on the agroclimatic conditions in these parishes, how suitable they are for the cultivation of wheat and other cereal grains. And then we combine those data and that exogenous variation with a quantitative spatial model to evaluate the impact of this trade shock on urbanization, structural transformation, and the income distribution in England and Wales. And given time constraints, most of what I do today, I'm going to focus on our reduced form evidence, and I'll just briefly flag aspects of the theoretical model. As those of you who spent any time in England and Wales know, it rains a lot. And so, as I mentioned, a key advantage of this empirical setting is we've got very large differences in agroclimatic conditions. In particular, there's a warm ocean current called the North Atlantic Drift and prevailing southwesterly winds, which bring moist air over England and Wales. And so the western parts of those countries have greater cloud cover, more precipitation, and lower average temperatures. They're also more mountainous, and hence they're not particularly suitable for the cultivation of cereal grains, and they're much more suitable for grass grazing, and hence pastoral farming, the grazing of cattle and sheep. In contrast, the eastern areas have less cloud cover, less precipitation, higher average temperatures, and better soils because they're more low-lying, and they're more suitable for the growing of grains. And so we're going to exploit that exogenous difference in agroclimatic conditions as a measure of exposure to this grain invasion. What do we find? We find substantial estimated treatment effects of the grain invasion. We find population declines of around 20 percentage points in high wheat-suitable regions relative to low wheat-suitable regions. We have individual level census data where we show that those population redistributions are achieved through the migration of individuals out of rural areas that are particularly exposed to the grain invasion. We find that this shock propels structural transformation away from agriculture. It leads to temporary increases in poverty as measured by poor law payments, and it leads to a reallocation of land use within agriculture away from grains towards pastoral farming and grass grazing. And all of these findings are consistent with a historical narrative of the Great Agricultural Depression that was particularly concentrated in eastern corn growing areas. I'm very short on time, so I'm just going to skip through the related literature. I know many of you here in the session today have made important contributions to this debate. Briefly mention the data we're going to use. We've put together this new parish-level data set for around 11,000 parishes, which is going to be our main source of data. It contains information on population by residents from the population census every year after 1801. From 1851 onwards, we've also got employment by occupation. Exciting feature of this setting is we also have individual level population census data, which allows us to track the individual adjustment margins through which people respond to this trade shock and follow individuals over time by matching individuals across subsequent census waves using techniques developed for the US population census in recent years. We've also digitized data on the value of land and buildings, which turns out to be an important input into our quantitative model. And so we can also look at the distributional consequences of this trade shock on the relative values of land and property. So let me get into what we do. Well, as many of you know, in the prior to the early 1800s, Britain was largely self-sufficient in grains, and historically, there were some corn laws, but they were relatively mild in terms of their restrictions on trade. They were often suspended in times of scarcity. And because Britain was largely self-sufficient in grain, there wasn't a large impact on the domestic price of wheat. Following the onset of the Industrial Revolution and rapid population growth, Britain starts to become a net importer of grains, and the corn laws start to become increasingly relevant. Obviously, from 1792 onwards until 1815, Britain was largely in conflict with France throughout most of that period in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. That widespread conflict in Europe meant Britain lost access to its traditional sources of supply of grains in Prussia and Russia. And obviously, for much of that time, Napoleon had a continental blockade. In the aftermath of victory in 1815, obviously, this loss of access to imports had led to a large rise in the domestic price of wheat during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And so in the aftermath of victory, Lord Liverpool, the Conservative Prime Minister, was very concerned about the possibility of a sudden influx of cheap imports of grains. Therefore, he enacted a new corn law in 1815, which marked a substantial increase in levels of protection and, in fact, prohibited imports of grains when the price of wheat was below a certain threshold. Obviously, that set up the classic distributional conflict of which many of you are aware between landowners who are the main producers or they benefited from the higher price of grain through increased prices of land. That conflict between them and urban workers who are the main consumers of grains, and merchants and manufacturers who were hurt by the restriction in trade volumes and the requirement to pay higher wages to compensate for a higher cost of bread. And so in response to that distributional conflict process from those losers from the corn laws, eventually in 1846, as you all know, Robert Peel famously repeals the corn laws and opens Britain's market to free trading grains. That cataclysmic political event splits the Tory party, and it means that a return to protection is not on the agenda. And so Britain stays open to free trading grains when the grain invasion occurs, in particular after the American Civil War in 1865 onwards. And this figure here just sort of illustrates some of those key historical trends. Before the repeal of the corn laws, what have we got here? We've got the bottom line here in red is British production of wheat, as estimated in particular by Sharp in his earlier work within economic history literature. The gap between the red and the black lines is UK imports of wheat. And this is all measured in quantities, quarters of tons. And so if you add up production plus imports, you get the black line, which is UK consumption of wheat, again in quantities. Before the repeal of the corn laws, we see in this figure that UK imports of grains were relatively small in magnitude. They mostly come from these traditional sources of supply in the rest of the world. From 1846 onwards, with the repeal of the corn laws, we see an increase in imports of grains. Initially, it's relatively modest. And then starting in 1861, the US starts to emerge as a big supplier of grains. That increases substantially after 1865, with the first transcontinental railroads in the United States and the opening up of the Midwest to world markets for grains. And so we start to see large imports of grains from the US into the UK, particularly from 1870 onwards. We also see Canada, Argentina, and Australia emerging as major new sources of grains in this grain invasion. How are we going to capture that? Well, as I said, we're going to look at the uneven geographical effects. This difference between west and eastern areas that I mentioned had been known for centuries. It was pointed out by Caird in his 1852 study of the history of English agriculture. He drew a line roughly down the middle of England, separating what he referred to as the corn counties in the east from the grazing counties to the west. In the right panel here, we've overlaid Cairn's black line on top of the United Nations measure of the agroclimatic conditions, the suitability for the cultivation of wheat, where lighter yellow colors mean more suitable for growing wheat. And as you can see, the Caird line does capture this large-scale difference in agroclimatic conditions. And we're using here the low input rain-fed cultivation measure of wheat suitability, consistent with agricultural production in England and Wales at this time. But you also see this.
You have 5 minutes left.
Great, thanks, that's no problem. And you also see there's quite a bit of variation we can exploit within these areas. What do we find? Well, this just illustrates large-scale structural transformation. We've got here the share of laborers and farmers in employment in 1851 in dark blue, and then in 1911 in red. And on the horizontal axis here, we've got lines of longitude going from west to east. And what do you see? You see in 1851, there are more farmers and laborers in the east than there are in the west. That's because arable farming is more labor intensive. Between 1851 and 1911, you see a large-scale decline in the share of farmers and agricultural laborers in employment that is particularly marked in the eastern counties, consistent with the grain invasion hitting arable farming in the eastern counties much more severely than pastoral farming in the western counties. And then here I've shown that some of those results where I plot changes in agricultural employment shares against suitability for cultivating wheat. So instead of east-west, it's now the suitability of areas for cultivating wheat according to our UN measure. What do you see? You see more wheat-suitable locations have bigger declines in agricultural employment in the top left. It's mainly driven by agricultural laborers in the top right. The trend in manufacturing share of employment is flat, so our findings are not being driven by a GE Dutch disease effect from the expansion of manufacturing. The main sector that sees a rising employment share is in fact services in the bottom right. Within agriculture, we see a systematic reallocation of agricultural land away from wheat. So this is showing you the change in wheat share of land against the initial level of wheat share. And you see this very stark downward sloping relationship with an R squared of 0.77. It's not driven by mean reversion because you see a very different pattern for all the other categories of agricultural land use. And in fact, if you plot the change in permanent pasture against the initial wheat share, you see that wheat land is reallocating towards permanent pasture, again, consistent with the story we're telling from this grain invasion. We provide more details on the timing of the shock using event study specifications with parish fixed effects and year fixed effects to control for secular trends. We then include a whole set of controls for other things that may have been going on in England and Wales at this time. All of these controls are interacted with year dummies. Obviously, the main effect of a parish characteristic is already captured by the parish fixed effect. So when we include these controls interacted with time, we're allowing for heterogeneous growth rates in all of these characteristics. Our controls include urban, rural, distance to London, distance to Manchester, distance to cities, distance to coal, Wales, all interacted with time to control for the fact, for example, industrial areas close to coal may have had faster growth for other reasons. In the first half of the 19th century, we're now showing the coefficient on the interaction between above median wheat suitability and time, year fixed effects. In the first half of the 19th century, we see no differences between high and low wheat suitable areas. Following the repeal of the Corn Laws, we see a decline in population of around 20% in high wheat suitable areas relative to low wheat suitable areas. And it becomes particularly big from 1871 onwards, exactly consistent with the timing of the grain invasion, exactly as we expect. We see a similar pattern for rateable values, so this is also affecting the value of land and buildings. When we look at poverty, we see temporary increases in poverty in high wheat suitable areas relative to low wheat suitable areas. And then when we look at our individual level migration data, we see that this population redistribution is being driven by individual migration. What am I showing here? I'm showing the probability that you out-migrate from a parish, and I'm graphing that against the initial wheat suitability of the initial parish in which you're located. I'm looking at those migration probabilities from 1851 to 61 in blue, That's the first year where we have the individual level data and we can compute migration probabilities. And that's a year when the grain invasion hasn't really started. And then I'm pooling all the later years where we have the individual level data, where the grain invasion has really kicked in. What do we see between the two time periods? We see this increase in the probability you out-migrate from a location, and it's particularly strong, it's particularly big in high wheat suitable areas, consistent again with the story we're telling from the grain invasion, which is in line with a vast historical literature on this great agricultural depression being particularly severe in corn growing areas. In my last minutes, I'll just briefly flag how we try to interpret that through the framework of a quantitative spatial model. We've got a world economy with many countries and with many parishes within England and Wales. We have two types of agents, landlords who are immobile and own the land, and workers who are mobile across parishes within England and Wales. But for the moment, we abstract from any international migration. Each worker can choose to migrate from where they're born to another location, and they also choose in which sector to work. But they face bilateral migration costs, which mean there are distributional consequences of the trade shock for workers, depending on where they start out in the economy. The economic activity takes place in agriculture, manufacturing, and services. Locations can differ in their amenities, productivities, bilateral trade and migration costs, and all of those things can change over time, again, to control for differential productivity growth in manufacturing in the Industrial Revolution. And we use the model to simulate a counterfactual for a trade shock that's concentrated in the arable part of the agricultural sector, and use the model to try to rationalize the reduced form findings that I showed you during this talk. But I'm out of time, so let me just very quickly wrap up. We looked again at the distributional consequences of trade shocks, focusing on the distributional consequences across geography. We showed we find large distributional impacts of this grain invasion in the second half of the 19th century, using our exogenous measure of exposure to the grain invasion. And then we combine that with a quantitative model to interpret the movements in population and the changes in land values. And I should stop there, which I think is exactly on time, to leave time for Doug, my discussant.
Right. Okay, yeah, thank you very much. So hopefully, is Doug Irwin in the Zoom room? Hopefully.
Yes, I am.
Okay, so Doug, yeah, can you share your screen now if you have something to share?
I have nothing to share except my words.
Okay, so go ahead then.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm a great fan of Steve's work, and not just this paper, but many of his other papers. So I commend the paper to you. It's really innovative and interesting, collects some new data, and really provides us with sort of a profile of this shock and how it unfolds. He opened by sort of motivating the paper, talking about the distributional consequences of trade and the China shock, the Otto and Hansen work that has captured the attention of so many international economists. It's very interesting comparison. So the China shock is generally considered to be a bad shock. It led to a lot of displaced workers in specific regions of the United States. These workers did not move, and they suffered lower wages. The China shock, fortunately, they show is that it really took place over a period of about 15 or 20 years. And in their most recent paper, they show that really the U.S. hasn't been under the impact of the China shock. Although it's had persistent effects, the China shock sort of went away by the great financial crisis of 2008, 2010 or so. This is a different shock. This might be considered a good shock. It also played out over a much longer period of time, almost half a century. Here we see workers moving, and presumably their wages and their economic prospects were improved, not diminished, although, as he just showed, those who remained behind, poverty rates did go up. So why might we think this was sort of a good shock? I've also done a paper on the repeal of the Corn Laws specifically, and we saw that once again there were we don't look at the geography so much, but we look at the income distributional consequences across different income earning groups. And we find that it hurt the top 10%, which were largely landowners, and that's consistent with the decline in land values and rental values shown in the paper, but it helps the bottom 90%. So presumably those workers who are going from relatively poor agricultural regions to more advanced urban areas would be better off. We don't see that directly in the paper. That's something I hope the quantitative model might be lend us some information on. This shock, the repeal of the Corn Laws sort of enables or facilitates or allows the great grain invasion of the later part of the 19th century to occur. But it'd be very interesting as the quantitative model is developed, whether it could be used for counterfactual examinations of wages and other outcomes. So, for example, one could imagine no repeal of the Corn Law, but the Great Grain Invasion still happens because of the extension of the railroads into the U.S. and Russia. So what would happen under that situation? Alternatively, what would have happened under a repeal of the Corn Laws with no grain invasion? The quantitative model, which isn't quite fully developed yet in terms of the version of the paper that I saw, hopefully will lend some insight into this. Another thing that, just to link this up to the older economic history literature that Jeff Williamson and Nick Crafts and others contributed to, there are a lot of sort of pushes and pulls across sectors going on during this period. Obviously, there's this push from agriculture, declining prices, the Great Grain Invasion, the repeal of the Corn Laws would add to that push, which is acting through prices. But also there's technological progress in agriculture, which might be pushing people out of agriculture anyway. And then, of course, there's also the pull of industry, the lure of drawing people to Manchester and Lancashire and elsewhere. And it'd be nice in the quantitative model if these push-pull factors could be sort of sorted out a little bit more. The reason why I suggest this might be sort of a pro-growth or positive shock is that I also think back to the Steve Broadberry's work in the Journal of Economic History on catch-up. And what he finds there is, I'm sure everyone in the room knows, is that moving labor out of agriculture into services and manufacturing was very important for catch-up in other countries. And also the rising productivity in the service sector was very important. So to the extent that this is facilitating a sort of pro-growth, pro-industrialization path for England, one might view it a little bit differently than, say, the China shock. So I think the paper right now is really interesting. I urge you to take a look at it. You'll learn something about really interesting time path of how the shock is playing out in terms of affecting agriculture in England. The setup, the big buildup is for the quantitative model to tell us more. So the way I sort of view the paper is the conductor's raised the baton, but hasn't quite, struck up the orchestra yet. So we got all these really interesting facts, and I'm really looking forward to what the model has to say about counterfactuals, push-pull factors, and all the other rich things that are going on in Britain at this time.
Okay, thank you, Doug. You've been very concise, and that leaves lots of times for questions. And I think the chat is up there, so anybody in the Zoom audience, if you have questions you want to pose, you can put them in the chat. I can read them out, but hopefully everybody, both Zoom and otherwise, can see them. But let me ask, does anybody in the in-person audience have any questions? Yeah, so you go up to the microphone. Pete, I think this microphone hopefully will work. Yeah. So anybody have any questions that they want to? Yeah, go ahead. So come up to the mic if you have questions. Can you hear me?
Not very well. Very, very faintly.
Want to try this one? Yeah, I can try to see if I can. Well, we don't need to switch the screen.
Hey, how about now? Better?
That's great. That's great.
Okay, thanks for the paper. It's fun to watch it progress. I have a couple of questions. One is, what's the state of the quantitative model? Uh-huh. And let me just ask a naive and general question, like, to help you kind of talk about it. What are we going to learn here that an HO model didn't give us? What light is it shedding on, how the world of, how the global economy worked in that period and what's new there? And then, kind of following Doug's lead, can you say anything about, well, he kind of posed it as a pro-growth, good shock for Britain. One might turn it around and say, well, the Corn Law repeal pushed Canada and the US and, Russia and other places to focus on primary goods, which some people feel is not necessarily a long-run growth strategy. So, did that push growth down in the rest of the world through this kind of externality effect? Okay, that's all. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you. Should I respond individually to questions or collect questions? How would the chair like me to respond? Okay, I can't really hear, but I think you said you want me to go ahead and just respond. So, firstly, thank you so much, Doug, for the great discussion.
So sorry, I think we have time. So if you want to respond both to Kris's question and then to Doug's comments. And who else has questions in the audience? Anybody in person have any questions they want to raise? Kris, okay, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. So yes, Steve, go ahead and respond then.
Great. So thank you, Doug, firstly, for such a great discussion, all the really helpful comments and suggestions. They're all really well taken. In terms of the quantitative model, yes, I apologize to you that the paper is still very much work in progress. We still keep making progress on it. We do think that that's really going to add quite a bit to the paper. And in particular, I like your suggestion of the separate counterfactuals for the corn law and the grain invasion. And that's something actually John Mokia also suggested to us. I think it's actually a terrific idea. And it'll be kind of a very nice feature of the model is that we can actually look separately at those two experiments as well as how they interact. So I think that's kind of very, very interesting. So I completely agree with that. And I also agree in terms of the pushes and pulls that another advantage of the model is that essentially we can also do counterfactuals where we, for example, hold everything in the agricultural sector constant, but change productivity in manufacturing, which is going to get to the pull factor, and it's going to also speak to that, at least some of the pull factors. So all of those suggestions were great and were really, really helpful. In terms of the comparison with the China shock, I also like your point that the grain invasion could be a different shock because it's actually pushing people out of agriculture, and there may be sort of wedges, differences in marginal products between the two sectors and so on. So I think that's also a very good, very interesting point. I think there are also other differences between the grain invasion and the current Otto-Dorn-Hansen shock. For example, one of the features that's different is obviously the welfare state in Britain was relatively primitive at that time, that if you were out of work, you went into the workhouse. And although the US welfare state is less generous than those in many other countries, it could be that in the economy today, there are greater sources of support for those who are negatively hit by shocks. And that could be one reason why we see less mobility of people across locations. It could also be because our data are quite finely grained and we're using the variation in agroclimatic conditions across locations. It could be that some of the movements actually occur across relatively small geographical distances. And so some of the Otto-Dorn-Hansen results may actually miss that because they cover quite large geographical areas. And using the individual level data, you actually see about 2/3 of migration is within 100 kilometers. So it's actually relatively small. And so I think that's also an important part of the story. In terms of Kris's questions as well, yeah, absolutely. We keep pushing with a quantitative model. We're making quite a lot of progress. One of the key things about it is it's going to help speak to these distributional implications that you mentioned. The model we have here is actually quite different from the Heckscher-Ohlin model. And again, connecting back to Otto-Dorn-Hansen, in many ways, trade economists missed the boat when it came to thinking about inequality, in part because they were thinking about at the aggregate level in frameworks like Heckscher-Ohlin. Whereas in reality, what Otto-Dorn-Hansen and others have shown is that trade shocks tend to be incredibly geographically localized. And in models where you have migration frictions, mobility frictions, that means that a lot of the distributional consequences of trade are geographical. We miss them if we look at the aggregate level. So we actually think that this framework here is really crucial to thinking about those distributional consequences, both for workers and also for landowners, where again, in the history literature, there's a lot of evidence that landowners in the corn counties were much more adversely affected than those elsewhere. But all of those are great suggestions and great comments and suggestions. I think I'm nearly out of time, so I don't want to talk too much longer, but just to thank you very much for all the helpful comments.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you both for keeping on time. So we will now, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for all the great comments and suggestions.
Yeah, so we're now going to fast forward about a century and sort of go in the opposite direction rather than less protection, more protection. And I'm going to try to screen share here and pull up with our in-person. Is this? It's on the desktop. Yeah, we had it before. That's Meissner. It's behind. That's Meissner. It's right here. Sure. The trade book, sure. Okay, can you get it in the full screen? That's what I'm saying. Okay, you want to try to do it? Does anybody know how to get to full screen? I'm not.
It should be Control L on a PC or Command L on a Mac if you're using Adobe. But you also have to share the screen with Zoom.
Grayed out. I don't know why it's grayed out. Anyone ever seen a grayed out one before?
We don't see it on Zoom, on the Zoom call, or at least I don't see it.
Okay, so
We should,
let's. Thanks.
okay, yeah, we got to show the screen.
Okay, can Zoom participants at least see a partial screen?
Yeah, we can see the partial screen now.
You could close the
Okay,
chat.
no,
too,
let's go. Just a minute.
Should be Control L on a Windows machine.
Yeah, not doing it. Yep, thank you. Thanks. Just click on it. There. All right, let's go with that. Okay. How's that? Okay. Okay, thanks so much for including us on this program. Can everyone hear me okay in the audience and on Zoom? Okay, thanks. Apologies for no mask, but I think just to level the playing field, since we're talking about trade, my co-conspirators on Zoom are not wearing masks, so I'm going to just try to be clear. This is joint work with Kirsten, Wandschneider, and Kevin O'Rourke, and the motivation of our paper is pretty clear. Comes out of the Trump administration's trade policies, which are kind of embodied in a tweet sent out by President Trump, when he was president in 2019, basically exemplifying kind of a naive view on trade about who wins and who loses in trade, and simplifying it down, says, trade wars are good and easy to win. When we were down 100 billion with a certain country and they get cute, we just don't trade anymore. We win big, it's easy. So, this was a call for us to because at the time commentators were using the 1930s as a cautionary tale about what might happen. It was a call to us to kind of go back and re-examine the evidence on Smoot-Hawley. Now, this is not to say by any means we're the first economic historians to look at Smoot-Hawley. There's a big and important literature on the effects of Smoot-Hawley, how it arose the political economy dimensions. Moreover, it's not to say that the Great Depression itself isn't a big explanator for the effects. That is to say, the fall in income or the fall in output is large enough to explain the fall in trade in and of itself, as panelist Doug Irwin has pointed out. But this isn't this doesn't really tell us anything about a trade war per se. In fact, it kind of poses the question, is there still room there for an argument about costs associated with countries retaliating in response to the passage of Smoot-Hawley? Moreover, Smoot-Hawley, its origins actually start before the Great Depression. This is legislation that's introduced even before President-elect Hoover is inaugurated. So what we were thinking was, when you go back and look at the historical evidence from the period, there are obvious parallels to the present. For example, in both cases, the trade war was initiated by the U.S. It was preceded by a sustained period of economic expansion for the U.S. economy, and it was targeted at there were targeted responses by U.S. trade partners, including boycotts of U.S. goods such as the film industry and automobiles in the 1930s. So what our contribution is going to be, again, with all respect to the large and important literature, we thought there was still something to be said about a trade war. And so the first thing to do is to kind of think about, well, what is a trade war? How do we distinguish it from other topics that have been studied in this period, such as the rise in protectionism? And the classic text on this is Conybeare, and he defines a trade war as a category of intense international conflict where states interact, bargain, and retaliate over economic objectives directly related to traded goods or services. And so the lacuna we're trying to fill is to provide an explicit empirical analysis of a trade war where the key aspect of that trade war is going to be retaliation. And so that's going to be our answer to this first question: how do we define and discern the effects of a trade war? We're going to be focusing on this neglected part of the 1930s trade literature, which is the retaliation against the passage of Smoot-Hawley. And so we're going to look at who retaliated and why, and how those responses to Smoot-Hawley affected the provocateur, in this case, the U.S.'s exports. And then we're going to, I probably won't have much time to say anything about it today, about the techniques we use, just because of this short time period, but we're also going to do some calculations and think about the welfare costs of the combatants. So, if you look across the literature, the key component of a trade war is timely retaliation. And so we want to try to come up with a way to think about how we could observe that component of the definition of a trade war. And what we do is we have two different definitions that we're going to focus on, and then the combination of those two. One we're going to define as threateners, and the other one we're going to define as retaliators. Retaliators are going to be the ones that actually impose tariffs, where we have sources from the period, League of Nations documents, contemporary authors such as Mann and Jones, who tell us particularly who passed timely tariffs in response to Smoot-Hawley. And then we have countries that filed petitions with the U.S. State Department in response to the potential passage of Smoot-Hawley. That is to say, they were going to file these in 1929 when the legislation was being debated. And we're going to use those two different definitions and match them up with two new data sets. One is a high-frequency data set, a quarterly data set on trade flows covering the 1920s and 1930s. And because of the frequency of the data and the fact that we're going to embed this in a gravity model framework, we're going to be able to tease out the effects associated with a trade war rather than a rise in general protectionism. The second data set we use is new product level data on U.S. exports. And this is a data set spanning 1926 to 1932. And so it's product group level data. And this is very useful because it's going to get at this idea of targeted retaliation. That part of the, if you recall the debates around or the conflict in the late teens in the Trump administration, there was talk of targeting particular boycotting China, potentially boycotting, say, U.S. higher education or tourism, and then going so far as to impose tariffs against goods that were either important U.S. exports to China, such as agriculture, or targeting states that produced exports that were particularly important for the election year. And so there's this notion that you can use trade strategically in a trade war to try to get at a particular trade partner. And so that's what's going to distinguish it again from protectionism. So the two other parts of the paper, again, that I'll have less time to talk about today, is we have a welfare analysis using techniques developed by Eaton and Kortum and Arkalakis and co-authors, and we extend that using a paper by Zylberberg, and co-authors to look at the inclusion of tariffs. And this is all, again, to complement this large existing literature on the Smoot-Hawley tariff. To preview our findings, we show that U.S. exports declined by an additional 28 to 32%, depending on the specification, to these countries that retaliated. So the countries that actually imposed tariffs are going to see the U.S. exports to those countries, or the imports into those countries that retaliated from the U.S. are going to fall by an additional 28 to 32%. And that's above and beyond the general decline that's taking place. In other words, the null here would be that, exports are declining everywhere during the Great Depression, and this is an additional fall of, roughly 30%. And there's substantial narrative evidence that we present in the paper that goes through and shows that there are a lot of not only just countries imposing tariffs, but there are also non-tariff barriers that are used. So, like, for example, quotas on the importation of U.S. automobiles, and then boycotts. So, like the Italian Automobile Club organizes a boycott. In Uruguay, they're boycotting U.S. automobiles. And so there are both state and non-state actions that are taking place here that are resulting in the targeting of U.S. exports. And so what's interesting is that because we have this other definition, which isn't the ones that retaliate, but rather just protested, we also see that their exports are falling by more than countries that did nothing. And here the effects, as we might expect, are smaller, but they're still substantial. They're around 20%, again, depending on the specification. So retaliators and protesters appear to have been also strategic in that they targeted U.S. exports. And this product level data set that we put into groups is nice because we can highlight the top 10 U.S. exports to each U.S. trade partner. And we can see that those fell disproportionately as well by around 22%. And it seems to be the case that how could they do this in the framework of MFN treaties at the time? They could do it in part because goods like American automobiles were produced by were product differentiated goods produced by high profile companies like Chrysler, Ford, GM. And we find that when we look at just that category of automobiles and parts, those fell by even a more pronounced amount, by 43%. So finally, Smoot-Hawley reduced welfare from trade by around 16% for retaliators through the end of 1931, and that's using these newer, quite elegant and simple models for estimating welfare effects. So I don't have time to get into the historical details, but most of you probably know that this was a major piece of trade legislation that resulted in more than a third of all product categories under the entire tariff schedule changing, with the majority of them seeing increases in rates, and the minority with falling. On average, tariffs on dutiable imports increased by about 6 percentage points, but within product categories, there's considerable difference, as you can imagine. This was all passed by President Hoover on June 17, 1930, but it's the lead up to that that's particularly interesting and relevant for us, in part because the Senate eventually passes a resolution requiring these U.S. State Department reports to be submitted as formal complaints. So you get over 500 pages in a congressional hearing where these country-specific protests are filed by states, specifying why they think they're going to be harmed if Smoot-Hawley passes. And that's what we use to categorize our protesters in this sample. And so these are going to be what we call either threateners. Those are the subset of countries that don't further respond with a tariff, or responders, which is the group of threateners and retaliators together. And so this is a big set of countries. In fact, between the threateners and the retaliators, you're going to see it constitutes a large share of U.S. trade. And so the responses were pretty immediate. Like for the countries that then did follow through with these petitions and actually raise their tariffs, the League of Nations reports on tariff-making activity in countries like Canada, Cuba, Mexico, France, Italy, and Spain that was directly in response to Smoot-Hawley. Even in places like Britain, you see new political parties formed in opposition to Smoot-Hawley and in opposition to U.S. exports. So the point is that this retaliation fulfills the definition of a trade war. And here is a list of the retaliators, the countries that actually imposed tariffs, and then the protesters, those that filed the petitions during the legislative process. You can see on this table that it involved most of the major U.S. Countries receiving U.S. exports, as well as most of the countries, the major trade partners of the U.S., where the U.S. was importing goods from them, with bold countries indicating countries that retaliated, italics indicating countries that petitioned, and bold and italics indicating petitioning and retaliating. What I'm gonna focus on in my few remaining minutes is two large data sets that we put together using all available country level national trade statistics. It allows us to get a sample of 99 economies, 55 of which are sovereign countries. We do the usual classification of colonies. We make adjustments when we can can't use both matching trade flows in both directions. We'll substitute exports, and we make sure that we're not just introducing a lot of noise when trade flows are very small. This is just the raw data showing you what we want to emphasize here, which is exports before and after the passage of Smoot-Hawley, with the red line indicating the date in which it was passed. And you can see for the responders a big change in U.S. exports. You can also see that most of the U.S. Trade partners were involved in retaliating, which is why, or responding, petitioning, which is why we view this as a trade war. So we use a gravity model to estimate these effects. And the important thing to take away from the gravity model is that because our data are quarterly, we're able to include exporter time, importer time, and pair fixed effects, which allows us to account for a long list of potential confounders that are country specific, other policy responses, global, like the Great Depression, as well as multilateral resistance. So this is kind of the gold standard of how to run a structural gravity model. And we can estimate these effects over time. We focus on, again, on imports, and we test whether retaliation or protesting reduced imports from the US relative to non-responders. So you've got different definitions here, either the threatener variable, those countries that petitioned but then didn't follow through, or the retaliators that actually passed tariffs. We account for the zeros in the trade data by using PPML specifications, and we include other kinds of historical factors that we know would be varying at the pair level across time, which is where identification is coming from. So again, the pairwise identification is time varying, so any threat to identification would come at that level. And these charts show, these charts show that it's about between 28 and 32%, depending on whether you use OLS or PPML, in terms of the retaliators, and then the threateners between 18 and 22%. So we have a variety of robustness and extensions, including focusing on sovereigns, looking at groups, dropping individual countries, controlling for the effects of devaluation. What I want to spend my last minute on is thinking about these strategic responses to Smoot-Hawley. As I said, we could think of variation occurring at the product level, and that's nice again because we can dig deeper into these data. So we have 104 product categories. We identify the top 10 exports for each U.S. trade partner, and then we go through and we look and see, using a similar set of gravity models, but using this product level data, we go and see, was it the case that they targeted the most important exports to each U.S. exports to each country? And in fact, you see good evidence of this taking place. The top 10 exports fall by proportionately even more in comparison to those more general estimates I showed you. And then if we look at the triple interaction and think about automobiles, we see an even stronger effect there, that this product differentiated good seems to fall by even more. So again, we have some really nice work on welfare effects. I'm sure Kris is going to comment on that, but let me just wrap up maybe with another tweet. Pete Navarro said on tariffs, "I don't believe any country will retaliate." Well, this is a cautionary tale we're telling you, that countries do retaliate and that the cost can be substantial. This trade war reduced U.S. exports by between 28 and 32%. And they seem to have been effective at navigating MFN by using strategic retaliation. Thanks so much. I think it's still screen sharing.
Yeah, that's your comment. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. It's not screen share, so hopefully you can.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'll do my best given the technology and the mask and all that. So thanks for inviting me to comment on this awesome paper by Mitchener, O'Rourke, and Wandschneider. I'm happy to do that. So first I have to put the obligatory joke and reference to Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Of course, everyone can't hear me. Take my mask off. All right, I'm happy with that. So everyone knows this tariff because it's been made famous in the classic movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off. But Mitchener, Wiedenmeyer, and O'Rourke have improved on it with a quantitative investigation of retaliation to this notorious tariff using state-of-the-art methods. Now, I have a quiz for you this morning. The question is, who once said this? Everybody, economists, agrees that protectionism is a bad thing, but when you try to quantify it, you often end up finding that it didn't matter very much. A, Bob Lucas, because he would say something like that. B, Jeff Williamson. C, Paul Krugman. Or D, Kevin O'Rourke, a co-author on this paper. Everyone knows the answer to this. The answer is D. Well, in this paper, there's actually a definitive answer. It is a quantification, and they do find that it does actually matter pretty significantly. So that's the old Kevin. This is the new Kevin. So my talk will, and the paper kind of covers a lot of ground, but they look at the determinants of retaliation quickly. They look at the impact of retaliation to U.S. Hikes and tariffs, including at the bilateral aggregate level and at the product level. And then they look at overall welfare. Kris said that I would comment a lot on the welfare calculation. I'm not going to do so. I'm actually going to talk for a second about the retaliation model. I'll talk a little bit more about the two trade models they use, and then I will be done. Okay, so they don't spend very much time on it, and I don't think it's the main battle in this paper, but they do include a model that tries to find the determinants of response. And I guess the only thing, I want to highlight two things here. One is that the reader gets a little bit lost in all the definitions here. You've got to do it, and I don't know what to do about it, but there's four kinds of possibilities here, I guess. Responders, as I read the paper, these are countries that file a formal complaint with the State Department or impose tariffs. That or could turn into an and be something else, I guess. Then there's retaliators, threateners, and protesters. So that's what I got out of reading the paper. And, there's all the permutations. And if we include and, then it gets even more complicated. But, really we're looking for responses in trade policy to U.S. policy. Well, this model, has a lot, leaves a lot to be desired, I think, and the authors would probably admit that. I guess here I would just say, are any of these things correlated with subsequent shocks? That is, does the state of the economy in the Depression drive trade policy, and is that correlated with any of these predetermined variables? I don't want to push too hard on this because I don't think this is the main part of the paper. The main part of the paper talks about the impact on trade from partner trade policy responses. And here I have a couple of questions. Let's stick for now to the aggregate trade data and think about when a country makes a response, what is driving that decision, and what could that be correlated with? As a specific example, from the literature, France responds to Britain's devaluation of sterling in late 1931, but France was also, according to the paper and historical evidence, a retaliator against Smoot-Hawley. So I guess the question here is, if the reaction to other shocks depends on previous or future reactions to U.S. trade policy, where does that get us? Where does that leave us? And there's a famous assumption in the causal inference literature, which is SUTVA, SUTVA, which is stable unit treatment, something, basically means there's endogeneity, and if there is, we're going to get a little bit worried. The responder variable is 0, 1, or whichever permutation you take, but you have a varying intensity of treatment. The level of tariffs may matter. We want to think about, it would be nice to know something about the long versus the short run effects. I'm getting out of time, so I just kind of want to wrap up here and talk about the product level trade data. These are great data, so thanks for including product level trade and making that available to the broader universe eventually. And this is great. Okay, and this is the direction that empirical historical trade data research is heading. So this is wonderful. Here, it brings up questions that recent empirical trade theory and empirical work has looked at, which is what's going on in the extensive and intensive margin. And new work now published in the JEH by Michael Huberman with his co-author Concha Beltran looks at Spain and finds in Spain that there's a important role for the extensive margin. So products are going out, and it's not just on the total value or the intensive margin, and those are interesting margins for how we think about trade. What I would say, adding to that is, it would be interesting, and the model's not, kind of adapted to doing that right now. And I've never really seen anything that does it. But, when you move from the intensive to the extensive margin, kind of moving over this hurdle or a threshold, and I don't know what to do about that. But, I list some things here. You can check for heterogeneity by, the different levels of trade. You could, run a translog model, which allows for, the elasticity to be non-constant. And, you could just try outright a hurdle or a selection model. I don't know what the best way to go is, but, I think that, it's another paper even, and somebody needs to work on that. Well, anyways, I think this is a great paper. Contrary to what Kevin said at the beginning, it is possible to quantify this stuff. And sometimes you do find big effects, and this is an example of. Nobody, strangely, has had the wherewithal to collect all the data necessary to do it, but they did it, and that's great. I think it's valuable for historians thinking about it, for people making silly movies in the 1980s. It's valuable for people talking about, trade theory and how trade wars work. It's good. And even as we've seen with the tweet and the reference to our beloved colleague from UC Irvine, Peter Navarro, relevant to current policy. So thanks for the paper, Kris, Kevin, and Kirsten, and look forward to more.
Okay, thanks very much. So we still have time for questions on this, and I'm going to see what I'd like to do. Stop the screen sharing, and I'll see actually in the chat. If any of the Zoom people have any questions, you can put them in the chat. Let me ask if anybody in the audience has questions, and then maybe Kris, if you want to come up and respond to the questions, you can do that. So is it Susan? Is that? Sorry. Yeah, you want to come up and pose your questions so the Zoom people can. So we have.
Very interesting paper, and also a very interesting discussion as well. My question's about thinking a bit about external validity. So knowing as much about the retaliators and the ones that threatened, and what maybe made it easier for them to take that stance would be helpful for thinking about future circumstances when it might be plausible that they might retaliate. I think one aspect of that I'd be interested in would be how did they offset this? Could they trade with someone else? Could they switch to some other source for autos? And kind of documenting how did they try to adjust, and that ease of adjustment might make it easier for countries to engage in this in the future.
What's the other question?
Yeah, so this is fascinating. I'm really happy to see this. I was wondering a little bit about thinking about welfare, that this is unlike other trade wars happening during that business. And it seems like for welfare, there's an important macro effect from the normal.
You can imagine that a macro panel. I don't know that I can read that.
Okay, I'll try to be real quick because I don't want to cut into our last paper. These are great comments by Kris. Thank you so much, and Sasha and Josh as well. Maybe I'll take most of Kris's up afterwards, but just acknowledge that Kevin is a very flexible thinker, and so I'm glad we were able to shift them to our perspective. No, just joking. So endogeneity, of course, is a really important question, and I think one of the advantages of using the product level data is then you're really down to this. You've got to come up with something that's time, product, and country pair specific variation. So it's really kind of getting rid of a lot of the threats to identification, but it doesn't still rule out the kind of important historical point you're raising, which is the sequencing of this. And I think, our last retaliator is 1930. And so it's, other than Argentina and a few Latin American countries, it's really like these exchange rate devaluations come after the retaliation we're thinking about in terms of the strict definition. So I think that's one way we can kind of at least use the timing of our data to get at this, but the historical point is still there. The extensive intensive margin is really interesting. Something Michael has brought that up to us. It's a great point. We did look at the categories that drop, and there's 37 product groups out of around 100 that fall to zero. So this is an interesting area for further exploration. Like you, we were kind of puzzled how to go forward with it. It's like an interesting thing we can see, but how we implement it is something I guess we're all going to have to start thinking more about. And so you're absolutely right about that. Sasha, that's a great point. Offsetting behavior, we have this, as Kris kind of highlighted, we have this little political economy kind of introductory section, which is just correlates. Like, is it driven by your trade characteristics with the US? Is it driven by your polity score and these kinds of things? And in that, we're trying to think through, like, kind of, do we have a Grossman-Helpman view of the world where maybe in democracies where we see a greater likelihood to protest or to retaliate? That's one of our results. Is that because it's more easy to lobby and to get the petition filed with the State Department? So it's true. And I think, what we thought about is like, wow, we'd really have to dig into each country and come up with some kind of detailed analysis of each country. And of course, we're trying to just characterize the trade war. So certainly more to be done on that perspective. And then Josh, finally, great point about these welfare effects and how we should think about them. When we started out the paper, we weren't even aware of more recent literature that actually kind of incorporates the effects of tariffs into these Eaton and Corton welfare or Archilochus et al. Welfare calculations. And this is precise. The point you bring up is precisely why, in a very simplified way, we should think about this, because we could think both that protection, there is an economic history literature arguing that protection can actually be, can lead to import substitution and generate domestic demand. And again, as you said, could, stimulate price expectations and be positive, right? So it comes down to, in some sense, the way I think when we find these not big effects, but they're effects that are there, it comes down to these tariff responses were not optimal tariffs, right? And so that's kind of the way I'm thinking about it. Like, I agree with you. It's out there. That argument's out there. And when we use these kind of nice, simple calculations, we find small but positive, or small but measurable effects on welfare. And we, I guess the way we think about it is like it wasn't as if these countries thought through the best way to raise it. They were instead retaliating. They were doing it in the context of this trade war. And so maybe if they had like really pushed on the optimal tariff idea, they could have gotten something, that was more welfare neutral. But in our case, we're kind of showing that the overall effects of the trade war were negative for the combatants. Thank you.
Now let's turn to our last paper. Vinzent, can you share your screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for having me. So I hope that you can see my screen. My name is Vinzent, and I'm from Lund University in Sweden, and I'll present one of my papers called Winners and Losers, the firm-level impact of tariffs in the late 19th century Sweden. So the motivation for this paper is sort of a paradox, namely whether tariff protection can be used to promote economic growth or industrialization more generally. And there have been a lot of studies looking at this from an aggregate perspective, so using cross-country regressions. And these studies resulted sort of in a paradox in the sense that for modern periods, we often observe a negative correlation between higher tariffs and economic growth, but for the late 19th century, there appears to be a positive correlation. And then subsequent studies looked into this, and this positive correlation does not appear across all countries. So surprisingly, some countries during the late 19th century actually experience also a negative correlation or no correlation at all. And I was sort of wondering why is this the case, or what could be an explanation for this? And one explanation could come from more modern trade models that argue that not all firms are affected equally by tariff protection. So what my goal in this paper is to look at really the firm level impact of tariff protection during the late 19th century, whether there is a positive impact, a negative impact, or no impact at all. And to do that, I leverage newly digitized firm-level data from Sweden. And I use Sweden both because it has great data, but also because it's a very typical case during the late 19th century. It had quite low tariffs going into the 1880s, but then it massively increased its tariffs. And what I find is that tariff protection had two opposing effects. At the aggregate level, there was actually no effect. And this sort of supports previous studies that also looked at the aggregate level. But then at the firm level, it had two opposing effects in the sense that only the initially low productivity firms profited from tariff protection, whereas the initially high productivity firms, they were hurt and they noticed declines in their productivity. And at the aggregate level, again, these two effects then cancel out. And in the end of the paper, I provide some suggestive evidence that tariffs could have shaped managerial efforts of these firms to a different extent, so that they increase sort of the incentives to innovate for the initially low productivity firms, but decrease those incentives for the initially high productivity firms. And then more broadly, these findings are in accordance with sort of more modern trade models. So the patterns during the late 19th century, they do not sort of appear that paradoxical. And it really matters to look at the firm level dynamics. So that's the paper in brief, and I'm going to go now through it a little bit more in detail. So I'm using the Swedish manufacturing census, which is a newly digitized source, and it covers all Swedish manufacturing firms during the late 19th century on a yearly basis. So this is how the raw data looks like. And we digitize this, and it tells us how the sales of firms, the profits of firms, their employment, so the number of workers broken down by gender, where they were. And we standardized all this information into 12 industries. And then I matched the industry level tariffs to those 12 industries. And I created an algorithm that sort of links these observations over time into a panel so that we can really follow individual establishments over time. As I said, Sweden was sort of a typical case during the late 19th century. It had quite low tariffs going into the 1880s because it had joined the Copton-Chevalier treaty network. But then in 1887, it first increased its agricultural tariffs by quite a lot. And then in 1892, it increased also its industrial tariffs, by quite a lot. So this is sort of the picture of Swedish tariffs during this period. You can see first the jump in agricultural tariffs. Industrial tariffs were still bound by then by these previous treaties, but they were allowed to freely fluctuate after 1891, and then they were increased in 1892. So those are the 12 industries at which I have tariff level data, which was provided by Victor Persavet. And then this is the main specification that I use in the paper. So I regress firm level outcomes on industry level tariffs. And then I control for establishment fixed effects and region by year fixed effects and other control variables. But then the crucial thing is that I include an interaction between tariffs and the initial productivity level of firms. So I determine the initial productivity level of all firms by looking at the sort of industry level productivity, and I determine how initially productive they were in comparison to their competitors, so that whether they were initially more or less productive than their competitors in their industry. And specifically, I define a dummy that takes 1 if they were the least initially productive, or 4 if they were the most initially productive. And that's based on the quartiles of the industry level productivity distribution. And this table then is really the key result of the paper. In the first column, I just regress firm level productivity on tariffs, and I find no effect. So one might think that tariffs had no effect on firm level outcomes. So it's the coefficient here in column 1 is very small and statistically insignificant. But then in column 2 and 3, I include this interaction and I include different control variables. And then we do see a sizable effects. So 1 percentage point increase in tariffs increases firm level productivity by about 3% for the initially least productive firms, whereas for the initially most productive firms, the effect is negative by about 3%. So those are the results graphically, and in the paper I've done many robustness checks. So I use different measures for productivity, and I also play around with different specifications and regression models. So I Windsorize the sample, for example, use a continuous measure to productivity frontier, and some other econometric techniques as well, and they all provide the same results. So then in the last part of the paper, I try to explain why do only initially low productivity firms benefit from tariff protection, whereas initially high productivity firms are hurt by it. And I draw on this more modern framework, according to which there are 2 effects. So there is a Schumpeterian effect and an escape competition effect. And each effect is more relevant for the 2 types of firms. So the Schumpeterian effect would argue that if you increase tariffs, you sort of decrease competition. And that should, especially for initially low productivity firms, sort of spur managerial efforts to innovate and become more productive. Whereas for the escape competition effect, if you increase tariffs, you decrease competition. And then if you're an initially very high productive firm, that sort of decreases your motivation to stay productive. So I think it's quite hard to show that these effects were actually taking place, but sort of suggestive evidence is the following. So I identify industries that were sort of more innovative or more open for innovation by looking at whether an industry had an above average patent rate or not. And then I run a triple interaction. So essentially the same model as before, but whether just including a triple interaction, whether a firm was in such a more innovative industry or not. And indeed, the findings are more pronounced in these more modern industries. And this also holds when using effective rates of protection, so not just nominal tariffs. So all in all, the paper shows that at the aggregate level, there is no or seems to be no effect of tariffs. But then if you really look at the firm level, there are effects. So looking at the firm level is important to understand how tariffs worked historically. And when doing so, it does not, or it seems to be similar to more modern or more recent dynamics. And then more broadly, if a country has different initial firm level characteristics, then it's also no surprise whether if they have different results in the tariff growth literature historically. So I think I'll end it here, and thank you very much for listening and for comments, and especially thanks to Kilian.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Vinzent. You've kept the time. In fact, you're under time, so that leaves plenty of time for a discussion. So maybe you could unshare your screen, and then we can turn to Kilian. I think Kilian is there. If you could share your screen, and then you can take it away.
Yes, I'll do that. A second. All right. I hope you can see my screen and the share the slides.
We're seeing your screen and we're seeing you. So
perfect. Great. Okay. So thanks for having me. And thanks to Vinzent for his presentation and for letting me read his paper. I'm gonna try to be very quick here regarding the summary first. So the question that he asked is obviously did tariffs promote growth in the 19th century? So this is the broad overarching question into which the paper actually falls. And this, I mean, I don't need to talk about this in a very extensive way. This, speaks to a very long-standing debate revolving around the tariff growth paradox. Where most contributions that we have so far draw on cross-country regressions. These have the well-known pitfalls, including spurious correlations, sample selection bias, and also problems in terms of measuring tariff rates, aggregate tariff rates, and so forth. And also the pooling that happens in most of these papers masks heterogeneity across and inside countries. And that's basically where Vinzent's paper comes in. He uses firm level data on outcomes and matches this firm level data with industry level data on tariffs in Sweden. He finds that when trying to estimate the impact of tariffs, he finds that the aggregate impact of tariffs on firm level productivity was statistically insignificant. But when he allows for heterogeneity, the regressions reveal that initially low productivity firms became more productive, and initially high productivity firms become less productive. Now, what's the main message? Obviously, heterogeneous impact at the country level may be driven by heterogeneity inside the country, or inside the countries, essentially. And my takeaways from the paper are, on the one hand, it's sort of a reminder that the absence of an aggregate effect should not blind us as to, or should not lead us to the conclusion that tariffs did not matter. In fact, the aggregate impact, as Vinzent shows, depends on, inter alia, the relative weight of different losers and winners inside a country, of course. I think it's also a story about caution in a sense, because the results suggest that 1 point in time zero results at the country level may actually be misleading in the sense that they may, not capture spillover effects that are dynamic between losers and winners over time, and that might only show up over time. So it's sort of I think the paper is sort of an invitation to think more carefully about lag structures and the short run and long run effects of tariffs. Now, overall, I think it's a nice paper. It's also a very short paper, so it's that's also a virtue nowadays, I think. It has amazing microdata, it has clean metrics, and also clear results. So my comments today, maybe surprisingly, are not going to be so much about identification, although you can always come up with a story there. I'm going to focus instead on theory and framing, because I think that's where something can be done still, and where you can perhaps get a bit further. So what's my starting point? So basically, my starting point is a comment on the theoretical underpinning. So you appeal to Jan and Steinwender and Jacobone to rationalize the low, to rationalize the different effects on the initially low and high productivity firms. And here I think so there are two problems essentially. So on the one hand, so if you look at the Chen and Steinwender paper, which is now out in the Journal of International Economics, their argument is essentially the following, namely that increased import competition actually leads to productivity of low firms, of low productivity firms to rise. So essentially, the channel that they have in mind is that competition fosters the effort at the firm level, especially among low productivity firms, because they want to prevent bankruptcy. And this basically contradicts your finding, I think, rather than explaining it. So I'm not really so sure that this is the way you want to go. When you look at the other paper, the Iacovone paper, what they actually argue is, or what he argues is that lower tariffs increase the productivity of firms in general in his model, but this increase is less strong for firms that are far from the technological frontier. So the channel that he has in mind is that there are laggard incumbents that cannot prevent entry despite innovation, essentially. And so they don't have this sort of incentive to innovate. And I'm skeptical about the way that you use that mechanism by turning it on its head, essentially, in the paper, because for example, in his model, the productivity increases actually happen for both types. It's just that they are less strong for the laggards. So I'm a little bit skeptical about the fact about your attempt to turn that around. But I'm not gonna try to propose another way how you can actually rationalize the results or think about the results in a theoretical way that perhaps might make sense, perhaps not, but perhaps it's helpful to go on, essentially, and to think about that further. So I think one important thing is that how you measure productivity in your paper, actually, and you measure productivity. So that's your main outcome variable, and you measure it as sales per worker. So it's not output per worker, but it's sales per worker. And so the precise translation of your findings would be higher tariffs actually lead to more sales per worker for firms that are initially selling less per worker, whereas higher tariffs lead to less sales per worker for firms initially selling more per worker. And so if you look at that, or if you translate it in that way, it's actually, I think, easier to interpret your findings in the sense that you come back to relatively standard, literature or a standard theory that you can use in order to think about what you find. And I think on the one hand, I mean, the first channel, it's basically about input protection that benefits initially less competitive firms. And there's a large literature here that goes on infant industry protection. Recently, a paper by UHA, and basically this kind of literature would also, in my mind, would also seem to be more in line with your case study and literature by Bloom that you cite in the paper. And with regard to the second channel, so why more competitive firms actually lose out once the tariffs are implemented, I think there might be several stories that you can tell there, but it might be that inputs become more expensive, especially for these firms, for this this group of firms, or perhaps also that trading partners retaliate. That's something I'm not sure about because I don't know the context so well, but that might be a theoretical explanation for what's going on for the kind of findings that you have in terms of econometric estimations. So basically, this is, I think, the main comment that I have with regard to the paper. Then there are some minor comments about the empirics that I want to flag, but these are minor because in a sense you already deal with them. On the one hand, the paper. So you mentioned as you mentioned in the paper, there is an issue about survivorship bias, and you try to deal with that, but you do not really follow through with the strategy in the sense that you use a fully balanced panel. And I think you should try to do that in order to just alleviate any concerns or do away with any concerns in that direction. And then with regard to the mechanisms and the channels, so I'm not sure about the Schumpeterian effect, and I don't really understand how it works, and that's perhaps also related to what I just said before. But perhaps it's not really actually needed anymore in that sense in order to explain what's going on in the paper. And when you split them, modern versus old firms in the triple interaction. I think there might be an issue of post-treatment bias in terms of how you group firms into those that are modern and those that are old and so forth, because you're using the whole period of observation. And finally, these are just readability things that I'm gonna send to you. So this is basically all that I want to say. And yeah, thanks for letting me read your work. Really enjoyed it.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. That leaves us some time for questions. I'm going to open the chat here. If anybody in the Zoom wants to put something in the chat. Does anybody in the audience have questions? While we're waiting, Killian gave us some very rich comments, I think. So Vinzent, if you want to respond to the comments, you can proceed to do that. Do you have any comments, Vinzent?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thanks a lot, Killian, for the great comments. I mean, regarding the Chen-Steinwender study, I think they look at a subset of firms, right? So they only say that their results apply to privately held or family businesses. So I don't know if they really translate to all firms that I look at here. Yeah, I think it's sort of, there are three effects in this literature that they postulate, and all effects go on at the same time. So it's sort of difficult for me to say which effect mattered most. But there, I appreciate that you provided these different framings. So then I see that there's a question in the chat.
Yeah, if you want to go ahead, can you read that? Do you want me to read it to you?
Yeah, no, I can read it. So the question is whether I looked at the trends in pre-tax income distribution during the same period. That the convergence of firm productivity may lead to a convergence of wages. No, I did not look at the pre-tax income distribution. So I mean, with the taxes, we don't really have that data as well. So sales is sort of the best what we can do at the moment. So I don't know if that would be possible.
Okay, we have a question from the audience from Kris. Oh, Kris Mitchener.
Hi, Vinzent. This is really interesting data. It's really neat to see what you're doing with your work, and I encourage you to continue. My question is, I was surprised your discussion didn't mention the Melitz model, the 2003 Melitz paper, in the sense that if you do have information on the trade exposure of each establishment, that would be very useful for them thinking about the reallocation of revenue within industries, and also kind of the process by which these productivity effects might occur, because that model delivers very clear predictions that are testable. So perhaps unlike these other models, you can actually kind of test it against a well-established theory and see how well that theory performs in the context of the Swedish experience. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for that comment. Yeah, so I did not include the Melitz model because, if I understand it correctly, there the sort of the assumption is that productivity does not change at the firm level, and then sort of. But I look at the evolution of firm level productivity, so I didn't really know how to bring it in a consistent way. That was the reason.
Okay, yeah, we have 1 or 2 minutes left, so we have maybe one final question.
Hi, Vinzent. This is the other Kris. So I'll just keep going on that. I mean, I think you have an opportunity here to come back to Melitz. I mean, show us the firm distribution, show us the size distribution of the firms before and after. Look within firms and then look at the extensive margin. I take it your data will allow us to see into that kind of black box that has heretofore been unstudied in historical data, to my knowledge, for the most part. So I think that's great, but I don't think you can skip over that literature so quickly.
Thanks. I'll take that comment up.
So we are about at time. I'm not seeing any questions in the audience or in the chat. So let me thank, let me adjourn the session. Just thank our presenters and discussants and audience for a very interesting discussion. So thank you all.
And thanks a lot.